Henry Lewis, an 82-year-old African-American veteran, raised his hand to open the door to the Riverside Diner. His hands, worn by time, spoke of a life of service. He just wanted to enjoy a quiet breakfast on Sunday, a simple treat for a man who had fought for his country. But in Ashwood, a city where prejudice was hidden under a facade of Southern hospitality, even something as simple as scrambled eggs could turn into a battle. As he settled into his seat, Henry could not foresee that this quiet morning would become a defining moment in his long and distinguished life. It was then that Tom Morgan, the owner of the diner, approached her with a look full of hatred and words full of discrimination. The air seemed to be fraught with tension, and unbeknownst to both, a group of seemingly rough customers watched from the corner, ready to turn the tide of justice in an unexpected way. The small town of Ashwood awoke to the soft glow of a Sunday morning. Their quaint shops and friendly faces projected the image of an almost idyllic tranquility, but beneath that peaceful facade, deep tensions ran, as in many cities in America. These were tensions that were about to surface in a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the community. In a modest house on the outskirts of the city, Henry woke up with the first ray of sunlight that filtered through the window of his room. His movements were slow, accompanied by the creaking of his joints, a sign of someone who had learned to move patiently. Her face, full of wrinkles, told a story of pride and adversity. Each line spoke of a complete life, marked by both laughter and suffering. Looking in the mirror, Henry saw not only his current reflection, but also echoes of his youth. For a brief moment, the image in the mirror seemed to transform, and Henry saw a young soldier with straight backs and bright eyes, full of idealism and ready to serve his country. The vision disappeared as quickly as it came, leaving him alone in the face of reality, a contrast between his youthful dreams and the life he now faced. Henry had served his country with honor, believing that his sacrifice would pave the way to a better future. But there he was, decades later, still facing the very prejudices he had hoped to help eradicate. He shook those heavy thoughts out of his mind and focused on preparing for the day. He carefully chose his clothes, putting on well-pressed pants and a neat shirt. The final touch to his outfit was a jacket from his time in the military, adorned with medals symbolizing sacrifices and moments of bravery. As he put it on, Henry felt the weight of those badges, not only physically, but also in the memories they evoked. Finally, he reached for his military cap, adjusting it precisely, which transported him back to that proud young man who had put on the uniform for the first time. Today was a day to try something new. His usual coffee shop, where he had become a familiar face, was closed for renovations. Although it was a small alteration in his routine, Henry decided to see it as an opportunity rather than an inconvenience. I had heard rumors about the Riverside Diner, and people praised its home cooking and warm atmosphere. The thought of those famous scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and freshly brewed coffee made his mouth water. As he walked to the diner, Henry greeted people he met politely. Some greeted him warmly, while others avoided his gaze or barely gave him a gesture of recognition. Over the years, Henry had learned to accept such reactions calmly, though each little slight reminded him of the divisions that still persisted, despite his service and sacrifice. Eventually, Henry arrived at the Riverside Diner. The store's facade was inviting, with a hand-painted sign swaying gently in the breeze proclaiming, "Riverside Diner, all are welcome." Henry smiled as he read the message, wishing it were true. As he opened the door, a soft jingle announced his arrival, and he was greeted by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and crisp bacon, a mixture of smells that flooded his senses and gave him a warm welcome. The atmosphere inside the diner was cozy and warm, with soft lights illuminating the wooden tables and comfortable booths. The place was moderately crowded for a Sunday morning, with a mix of customers filling the space. There were families enjoying a relaxed breakfast, couples chatting quietly over cups of steaming coffee, and a few lonely diners engrossed in newspapers or books. In one corner, a group of bikers added an unexpected element to the scene, with their patched leather jackets and their intense but relaxed looks. Henry paused for a moment, looking at the place. He felt a little nervousness in his stomach, the kind of uneasiness that accompanies stepping into uncharted territory. However, he reminded himself that he had faced much more challenging situations in his life. With a deep breath, he ventured completely inside the diner, ready to experience what this new place had to offer. As he went, Henry moved his eyes from side to side, a habit acquired in his military days, taking note of every detail around him. He looked at the weathered but well-kept wooden floor, the mismatched chairs that somehow added to the charm of the place, and the local artwork that adorned the walls, each telling a story of the town of Ashwood. A young waitress, wearing a nameplate that read Emily, approached him with a warm, friendly smile. Her eyes wrinkled at the corners of her mouth as she smiled, reminding Henry of his own granddaughter. The resemblance awakened in him a mixture of feelings, love for his family, and a slight sadness at the distance that often separated them. "Good morning, sir," Emily greeted cheerfully. "Welcome to the Riverside Diner. Would you like a table or a seat at the counter?" Henry smiled back, feeling a little more comfortable thanks to his kindness. "Good morning," he replied in his deep, experienced voice. "A cabin would be nice if you have one available." Emily nodded, pointing to a booth near the window. "This way, sir." "It's a lovely place. You can watch the village wake up as you enjoy your breakfast." Settling into the cockpit, Henry straightened his posture, a habit deeply rooted by his years of service. The vinyl seat creaked under his weight, a sound that somehow added to the cozy atmosphere of the place. Emily placed a menu in front of him, the laminated pages showing signs of frequent use, a good indication that the place was loved by his customers. "Shall I bring you coffee to start?" Emily asked. Henry nodded gratefully. "It would be wonderful, thank you." As Emily walked away to get the coffee, Henry scanned the room again, watching the other diners. He saw families enjoying their breakfast, with the laughter of children filling the air and providing a cheerful contrast to the general murmur of conversation. On the corner, the group of motorcyclists continued their lively conversation, their presence adding an unexpected touch to the atmosphere. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and crispy bacon filled the air, and Henry couldn't help but feel his stomach growling in anticipation. The menu offered a variety of homemade dishes, but Henry's eyes fell on the diner's special, scrambled eggs with crispy bacon and a side of browned croquettes. It sounded perfect for the quiet morning I had imagined. Emily returned with a steaming cup of coffee, and the rich aroma filled Henry with a sense of comfort. "Here you go, sir," she said, placing the cup in front of him. "Ready to order or need a few more minutes?" Henry was about to respond when a noise in the kitchen caught his attention. The swinging door opened and a man emerged, his bald head glistening under the lights of the diner. Henry assumed that this must be the owner, Tom Morgan. The man, who seemed to be around 40, began to look around the place, greeting some regular customers with a slight gesture. However, when Tom's gaze fell on Henry, his expression changed. The warmth in his eyes faded, and his smile transformed into a cold grimace. Henry felt a familiar sinking sensation in his stomach. He had seen that expression too many times in his life, a look that, without the need for words, told him that he was not welcome. For a moment, Henry considered leaving, avoiding the confrontation he felt was coming. But after a lifetime of standing firmly and fighting for her right to exist in spaces where others believed she shouldn't be, she stayed in her seat. She turned again to Emily, who seemed oblivious to the change in Tom's countenance. "I think I'll take the special," Henry said, his voice steady, despite the growing discomfort in his chest. "And maybe toast, if possible." Emily wrote down her order with a smile. "Excellent choice. Our scrambled eggs are famous throughout the village. I'll put your order right away." As Emily walked away, Henry focused on the coffee in front of him, trying to enjoy the aroma and the cozy atmosphere. But he couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful morning was about to be cut short. Tom, the owner, had disappeared into the kitchen, and Henry heard muffled voices, an urgent, slightly heated conversation. A few moments later, the kitchen door opened again, and Tom stepped out, his face hardened and his gaze fixed on Henry. With each step she took toward him, the tension in the room seemed to intensify. Henry took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. Tom stood in front of Henry's table, his brow furrowed and his jaw clenched. The friendly expression he had shown to the other customers had faded, replaced by a hostility that Henry recognized instantly. He had faced expressions like this all his life. "We're full today, so you'll have to go," Tom said in a gruff voice, trying to sound authoritative, though his voice trembled slightly, betraying a hint of insecurity. Henry blinked, shocked by the blatant lie. He looked around the diner, noticing several empty tables and available seats at the counter. His confusion must have been evident, for Tom's face became even more tense. "Excuse me," Henry began, maintaining a calm, measured tone, "but there seem to be plenty of places. Is there a problem?" Tom stared at him, his expression hardening more. "I said we're full. We have the right to deny service to whomever we want." The words echoed through the diner, attracting the attention of the other customers. Henry felt a weight in his chest, a mixture of disappointment and resignation. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that things would have changed more in the time he had served his country. But there he was, decades later, facing the same prejudices he had known in his youth. Slowly, Henry stood, his movements deliberate and full of dignity, though he felt the burning of humiliation in his chest. He rested one hand on the table, controlling the emotions that stirred within him. "Sir," he said quietly but clearly, "I am not looking for trouble. I just want to enjoy my breakfast like anyone else here." The patience in his tone was that of a man who had faced this situation many times before. But underneath that patience, there was a sadness, a weariness of realizing that in some places things seemed to never change. Tom didn't hesitate to answer, his voice rising. "Your guy is not welcome here. This is a respectable place." The words hung in the air with surprising rawness. A mixture of shock and disapproval ran through the other customers. Henry felt as if he had been physically beaten. The coldness with which Tom had dehumanized him, the way he had nullified his right to enjoy a breakfast in peace, reminded him of the battles he had fought, both in distant lands and in his own country. Henry looked around the diner, noticing the various reactions of the other diners. Some were surprised and disgusted at Tom's behavior. Others avoided the gaze, uncomfortable. With pain in his heart, Henry also noticed a few who seemed to agree with Tom's words. Henry's gaze fell on Emily, the young waitress who had kindly served him. His face showed a mixture of horror and shame, and his hands trembled as he gripped his notebook tightly, so much so that his knuckles were pale. Although she seemed clearly affected by Tom's attitude, the fear of losing her job kept her silent. In the midst of the awkward silence that had fallen on the diner, Henry felt the weight of all eyes on him. Each person present observed, with their own judgments and expectations. For a moment, Henry felt tired, exhausted from years of living these same situations in different cities and in different places. He recalled the times he had gone through something similar in other restaurants, in cities big and small, and even in his own military service. He thought about the progress he had seen, the battles won, but also how far he still had to go. With a deep breath, Henry straightened his shoulders, feeling the need to remain firm and dignified. I had two options. He could go quietly and avoid a confrontation, but that would mean allowing Tom's hatred and prejudice to go unchallenged. Or he could stand in the place and demand the respect he deserved like any other customer. Henry knew, deep down, that there wasn't really an option. His fighting spirit pushed him to resist, as he had always done. With deliberate movements, Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out his military ID. The plastic was worn, but the details were still clear. "I have served this country for more than 30 years, Henry said, his voice firm but tinged with deep sadness. His words floated in the air, loaded with the experiences and sacrifices that had marked him. As he spoke those words, Henry recalled the times he had defended his country with honor and courage. In his mind, he saw himself again as that young man in uniform with hope and determination, ready to give everything for a better future. He thought of his friends, of the battles fought, of the losses suffered, all for a country that sometimes still looked at him with distrust. For a brief moment, Tom's look seemed to show a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. But soon his expression changed back to one of hostility, and his voice emerged with a cutting tone. "I don't care what you did," Tom replied, his voice trembling slightly. "You're not welcome here. Get out before he calls the police." The threat felt like a blow, reminding Henry of the times that same phrase had been used to remind him of his place in society. He felt a deep wound at Tom's disdain for his service and his years devoted to the defense of the nation. For a moment, Henry felt the impulse to argue, to make Tom understand the injustice of the situation. However, years of similar experiences had taught him the futility of trying to change such a closed mind. With a heavy heart, Henry stepped toward the door, his shoulders slightly slumped under the weight of this last act of rejection. Just as he was about to reach the door handle, the silence in the diner was broken by the sound of chairs scraping the floor, a loud sound that reverberated through the place. Surprised, Henry turned around, his hand still on the door, and what he saw made him stop. The group of motorcyclists who had been watching from the corner were now standing. Their leader, a tall man with a grey beard, was advancing toward him and Tom. His step was firm, and there was in his gaze a calm authority which attracted the attention of everyone in the place. Behind him, the rest of the riders lined up, creating an imposing presence. Henry felt a mix of emotions: surprise at the unexpected turn of events, curiosity about what the bikers intended to do, and a slight apprehension. He had long ago learned not to make assumptions based on appearances, but he couldn't help but wonder what these rough men would do. The leader of the bikers stopped a few steps away from Henry and Tom, his watchful eyes moving between them as he assessed the situation. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but with a firm tone that demanded attention. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" she asked, looking directly at Tom. Tom, who had been so sure of himself in confronting Henry, now seemed insecure and surprised by this unexpected intervention. His eyes swept around the room, as if he was looking for support or a way to escape the situation. A few drops of sweat began to appear on his forehead. "This is none of your business," said Tom, trying to maintain his defiant tone, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. "This is between him and me." He pointed vaguely to Henry, taking a step back. Henry stayed in place, still with his hand on the door, caught between the decision to leave or stay, but curious about what would happen. Years of experience had taught him to be cautious, but something about the motorcyclist's attitude inspired a certain confidence. The atmosphere in the diner had changed, and the tension was palpable. Anticipation mingled with anticipation, as if everyone present was holding their breath, waiting to see which way the scales would tip. What had started as a simple breakfast had become something much more important, in a moment loaded with symbolism and meaning. The leader of the bikers, whose name was Rick Daniels, remained calm despite Tom's defiant attitude. "We couldn't help but listen to your conversation," Rick said, not taking Tom's eyes off, "and we have a few things to say about it." Tom, his face turning redder and redder, tried to reassert his authority. "This is my money and I have the right to serve whoever I want," he growled, but his voice trembled slightly as his nervous eyes sought support from the other diners, who avoided his gaze, uncomfortable with the situation. Rick, showing no sign of backing down, nodded with calculated calm. "You're right," he conceded. "This is your business. But having rights also means having responsibilities, and one of those responsibilities is to treat everyone with respect and dignity." As he spoke, Rick slipped a hand into his leather jacket. Tom drew back instinctively, as if expecting something threatening. But what Rick pulled out was a worn-out leather wallet. He pulled out a card and held it up, showing an old military ID, similar to the one Henry had shown minutes before. "Look, most of us here are veterans too," Rick continued, his voice taking on a serious but emotional tone. "We have served alongside people of all races, beliefs, and backgrounds. We've bled together, fought together, cried together." A murmur ran through the diner as the other riders stepped forward, each displaying symbols of their time on duty. Some showed military cards like Rick's, while others rolled up the sleeves of their jackets to show military tattoos, marking their commitment to their country. One of the bikers, an African-American man with grey hair at his temples, joined Rick in front. His eyes shone with controlled anger as he looked at Tom. "We fight alongside men and women of all colours," he said firmly. "There is no room for prejudice here or anywhere." Tom, perceiving that he was outnumbered, began to look more and more agitated. His face showed a mixture of fear and hatred as he looked around, waiting for some sign of support from the other customers, but he only met with looks of disapproval and rejection. "This is my money! Tom shouted, his voice growing more and more shrill and out of control. "I decide who I serve and who I don't!" he spat angrily, his hands clenching and releasing in an effort to maintain his composure. Rick remained calm in the face of Tom's explosion and simply responded calmly. "And we have the right to take our money somewhere else," he said, his tone so firm that it left no room for doubt. "But first, you owe this man an apology." Tom, however, seemed to be beyond reason. The confrontation had pushed him to the limit, and his next words came out in a torrent of hatred and frustration. "Get out, everyone! This is my place, and I decide who stays and who goes." Rick, who had introduced himself to Henry as a man of firm convictions, leaned over to him with a reassuring look. "Don't worry, my friend," he said softly. "We solve this in our own way, without violence." The other riders nodded, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and purpose. Without saying anything else, Rick signaled, and the bikers began to leave the diner, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor as they drove away in order. As each passed Henry, they offered him a respectful nod or a word of support. Henry felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by this unexpected act of solidarity. I had never imagined that I would receive this kind of endorsement from complete strangers. Once outside, the motorcyclists mounted their motorcycles, and the roar of the engines filled the air. Henry watched from the doorway, feeling surprisingly comforted by the sound, which seemed a symbol of freedom and power. It was as if their new friends were reclaiming the space that Tom had tried to deny them. As the motorcycle engines drove away, lively conversation erupted inside the diner. Some customers left, clearly upset with what had happened, while others were arguing heatedly among themselves. The events of that morning had left everyone with emotions running high. Emily, the young waitress, cautiously approached Henry, her face showing an expression of shame and regret. "I'm very sorry, sir. Your breakfast is at the house's expense if you still want it," he said quietly, his eyes reflecting a sincere apology. Henry looked at her with a kind expression and gave her a small smile. "Thank you, Emily, but I think I've lost my appetite," she replied softly. It was quite an intense morning, hence. Henry left the diner and met the motorcyclists, who had formed a circle around him, protecting him in some way. Rick walked closer to Henry, his eyes reflecting a mixture of respect and concern. "Are you okay?" he asked in a hoarse but friendly voice. Henry nodded, still processing everything that had just happened. "I'm fine, Rick. I just want to thank you all. They didn't have to do that," he replied, his voice charged with genuine emotion. Motorcyclists gathered around him, their leather jackets glistening in the morning sun, and Henry felt enveloped in a kind of protection and solidarity he hadn't felt in years. Rick placed a firm hand on Henry's shoulder. "We always defend our own," he said firmly. "No veteran should be treated the way you were treated today. It goes against everything we stood for." Henry felt a surge of gratitude and a lump in his throat. He had often felt as if he was fighting these battles alone, and now, unexpectedly, he had found a group of men willing to fight for his dignity. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "This means more than you can imagine." Rick stared back at her, acknowledging the impact they had had on Henry and the deep appreciation he expressed. "You don't have to thank him, Henry," Rick said, with a warm but determined smile. "What happened in there is not only your struggle, it is our fight too." The motorcyclists, seeing the intensity of the situation, nodded in agreement with Rick. Henry looked at each of their faces, recognizing in their eyes a mixture of pride and contained anger. Although each of them had their own story and experience, they all shared a bond of brotherhood and a commitment to justice. Rick looked down at the diner, and Henry detected a hint of cunning in his expression. "And as for that Tom, don't worry, we have our own ways of solving this kind of thing. We're going to make him understand that his actions have consequences," she said, assuring Henry in a firm tone, but without any trace of violence in her words. "What do you intend to do?" Henry asked, curious and a little worried. He did not want his new allies to take an aggressive stance. She had seen enough violence in her life, and she didn't want this situation to become another one. Rick patted her on the shoulder and gave her a calm smile. "Don't worry, Henry. There will be no fight. But we believe in letting Tom know that his decisions will cost him dearly, especially where it hurts most, in his business." Henry felt a mixture of relief and curiosity at Rick's words. He watched as the motorcyclists rode back on their motorcycles, preparing to retire, but with a firmness in their gestures that indicated they were not going to sit idly by. With the noise of motorcycles roaring in the background, Henry felt accompanied, supported. As the engines drove away through the streets of Ashwood, the echo of their solidarity echoed like a statement of support and justice. The next morning, Henry woke up early, as he usually did, and couldn't help but think about the events of the previous day. He remembered every detail: Tom's hostility, the unexpected intervention of Rick and his companions, and the deep emotion he felt at being defended in such a genuine way. Henry prepared for his day with his usual routine, but there was something that drove him back to the centre of town. As he walked through the streets of Ashwood, he realised that something had changed inside him. I felt a mixture of sadness and hope that I hadn't experienced in a long time. As he approached the Riverside Diner, he noticed that something unusual was happening. A sizable crowd had gathered in front of the venue, much larger than the flow of customers that usually existed on a normal morning. Henry frowned curiously and walked over to see what was going on. To his surprise, the diner was surrounded by a row of motorcycles parked in front of the entrance, their shiny chrome reflecting the morning sunlight. And in front of the motorcycles, forming a kind of human barrier, were Rick and more than 50 motorcyclists, many more than had been the previous morning. The scene was impressive. The motorcyclists, silent but steadfast, stood there with a peaceful but powerful presence. Many of them wore military insignia on their jackets, and the entire community watched in amazement, taking photos, recording videos, and whispering to each other. Henry watched in amazement as Rick advanced toward him from the group, a smile on his face. "Good morning, Henry," Rick greeted him, nodding with satisfaction at the sight of the diner. "It's a good image, don't you think?" Henry, still shocked by the scene, nodded slowly. "I had no idea that this is what you meant by solve it our way. I never thought something like this could happen in Ashwood," he admitted, astonished. Rick let out a low, deep laugh. "Sometimes, to make a place change, you have to remind people that we are all important. What happened to you was not only an offence to you, but to all of us." While they were talking, the door of the diner opened and Tom came out, his face full of fury and bewilderment. He looked around, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected peaceful protest that had erupted at the door of his establishment. "What is all this?" Tom exclaimed, addressing Rick indignantly. "This is crazy! They're scaring away my customers." Rick stood his ground and looked at Tom calmly. "This is just a group of veterans who decided to have breakfast at a local diner," he replied in a calm but firm voice. "If there is a problem, it is a problem that you created yourself." Tom, unable to contain his frustration, returned to the diner and slammed the door shut, but not before casting one last hateful glance at the group. Henry watched as the crowd continued to swell and realized that this act of solidarity was capturing the attention of the entire city. The crowd that had gathered in front of the diner continued to grow, and some passers-by began to join the group of motorcyclists in their peaceful protest. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of support and expectation. News of what had happened to Henry the day before had spread quickly, and many wanted to show their solidarity. Soon after, a local police patrol arrived, and 2 officers got out of the car, watching the scene cautiously. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with hair starting to turn grey at his temples, advanced toward Rick and the group of bikers, a look of professionalism on his face. "What's going on here?" Officer Brown asked, looking at Rick seriously but not aggressively. Rick stepped forward to answer him, maintaining a respectful posture. "Good morning, officer. We are a group of veterans who heard about an incident of discrimination at this facility, and we are here to peacefully protest and show our support for our partner Henry." Officer Brown nodded, watching Henry and then the other motorcyclists assessing the situation. At last, he glanced briefly at the diner, where Tom was watching from the window with an expression of displeasure and nervousness. "As long as they remain peaceful and don't obstruct the passage or access to the diner, they have a right to demonstrate here," said Officer Brown, clearly aware that the protest was within the law. The mention of the word protest seemed to irritate Tom even more, and he left the diner with an angry expression. "Officer! This is ruining my business! "You must do something!" he exclaimed, pointing at the motorcyclists furiously. Officer Brown turned to Tom calmly and professionally. "Sir, they are within their right to protest peacefully. If you feel like this situation is affecting your business, maybe you should reconsider why you're here in the first place," he said, shooting him a look that suggested a mixture of disapproval and warning. Tom, visibly frustrated and unable to find an easy way out of the situation, retreated inside the diner, leaving the officers and the group of bikers alone. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere continued to fill with people who wanted to show their support. Even some of Henry's neighbors and friends came to show solidarity with him. Local reporters, alerted by the growing crowd and the unusual event in the small town of Ashwood, arrived with their cameras and microphones. They approached Rick, who briefly explained what happened and the reason for his presence there. He spoke of the importance of unity and respect, and how they hoped their message would be a call for reflection for the community. Henry, watching this all unfold, was overwhelmed by the amount of support he was receiving. What had begun as a morning filled with humiliation and frustration had morphed into an act of solidarity and resistance that seemed to symbolize much more than he had imagined. Rick walked over to Henry and patted him on the shoulder. "This is just the beginning, my friend. We're not here just for today. We're going to make this place change, one way or another," he said with a knowing smile. As the days went by, the impact of the protest on the diner became evident. Every morning, the group of motorcyclists organized themselves to go in shifts, ensuring that there was always a visible presence in front of the place. The clientele began to shrink dramatically, and the diner, which had once been a popular meeting point, began to look deserted. Tom tried to counter the situation, but soon realized that community pressure was seriously affecting his business. The peaceful protest had gained strength and had become a boycott of the diner, reflecting the community's rejection of the owner's discriminatory behavior. After several weeks, the situation became untenable for Tom. Motorcyclists continued their daily protest, and more people joined them in an act of rejection. Finally, Tom, exhausted and unable to sustain the business, made the difficult decision to put the money up for sale. Rick and his group of bikers, anticipating this moment, organized to make him an offer. Henry was invited by Rick to witness this important occasion, and he was deeply moved to see the turn of the situation. He was about to witness a real transformation in the place that, weeks before, had denied him something as simple as breakfast. Tom, visibly defeated, signed the in-papers in silence, his expression a mixture of resignation and regret. Rick and the bikers took ownership of the diner, determined to transform the place into a symbol of inclusion and respect for everyone in Ashwood. News of the new acquisition quickly spread through the village, and motorcyclists, along with some community volunteers, began remodeling the place. The old Riverside Diner sign was removed and replaced with a new one, which read Patch and Stripe Café, honoring the veteran and biker communities that had joined forces to fight injustice. The reopening of the cafe, now called the Patch and Stripe Café, became a community event. Ashwood residents, intrigued by the changes and motivated by a desire to support this new version of the venue, gathered on the opening day. The cafe's facade had been renovated and decorated in a cozy and colourful style, reflecting the inclusivity the place now represented. Inside the cafe, the walls were adorned with photographs and memorials celebrating diversity and military service. There were images of veterans from different eras and nationalities, all sharing a common bond of service. The transformation of space was both physical and symbolic, and the community noticed and appreciated that change. To Henry's surprise and gratitude, Rick asked him to be the first customer to walk through the doors of the renovated Patch and Stripe Cafe. Henry, who was honoured and moved, accepted the honour. As he entered the cafe, he was greeted with applause and smiles, both from the motorcyclists and from the other inhabitants of the community who had supported him in his struggle. The new atmosphere of the cafe was vibrant and welcoming. The sound of conversations and laughter filled the space, replacing the tense atmosphere that had characterized the diner weeks before. Henry looked around, noticing how the tables were filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, sharing the space in harmony. Rick greeted Henry with a strong handshake, guiding him to a table at the counter in the exact same spot where Henry had faced discrimination on his last visit. This time, however, the atmosphere was completely different, full of acceptance and camaraderie. "What do you think, Henry?" Rick asked with a proud smile, pointing to the diners filling the coffee. "We have done this together, and all thanks to your courage and perseverance." Henry, visibly moved, nodded as he looked around the place. It was amazing how something that had once caused her so much pain and humiliation had now become a symbol of change and hope. "It's more than I could have ever imagined. They've transformed it into something beautiful," Henry replied, his voice full of gratitude. Emily, the young waitress who had served Henry on his first visit, approached with a big smile and a notebook in hand. "Good morning, Henry. Would you like a coffee?" he offered in a warm and friendly tone. Henry noticed that he was wearing a small pin on his apron that read, "Equality serves everyone." Henry smiled and nodded, handing out the cup. "Thank you, Emily. Yes, I'd love a coffee, and you can call me Henry," he replied gratefully. This time, the simple gesture of receiving a cup of coffee seemed full of meaning to him, a sign of respect and kindness that he deeply valued. Rick, taking a seat next to Henry, raised his own cup and proposed a toast. "What do you think if we make a toast, my friend?" he asked, raising his cup in a symbolic gesture that caught the attention of everyone present in the cafe. Henry, taking his cup, looked at Rick and nodded. "And why do we toast?" he asked curiously and with a slight smile. Rick swept the place with his eyes, watching the various people filling the cafe, and then looked back at Henry. "For unexpected friendships, for standing up for what's right, for second chances and new beginnings." Henry, moved, added firmly and in a voice full of emotion, "And for a future in which everyone feels welcome." The cups clinked in a toast, and the sound echoed through the coffee, symbolizing something bigger than a simple gesture. It represented the unity of a community that had decided not to remain silent in the face of injustice, that had stepped forward to do the right thing. Throughout the day, the cafe was filled with people from all over Ashwood, creating a vibrant and welcoming atmosphere. Henry watched families, couples, and friends sharing tables and laughing. The vision of an inclusive and friendly space filled him with hope. In a corner of the cafe, Henry watched a young boy approaching an elderly African-American couple sitting at a nearby table. The child's parents watched the interaction with some nervousness, but their expressions changed to surprise and joy as they saw how the child happily chatted with the couple. This small, though simple moment seemed to represent everything that Patch and Stripe Cafe meant now. Henry smiled as he watched the barriers crumble at a child's innocence and curiosity, and he felt a deep peace and satisfaction as he witnessed the transformation of the cafe into a place where everyone could feel welcome. As Henry reflected on what he had witnessed, Emily approached with a coffee maker to offer him a refill of his cup. "A little more coffee, Henry?" he asked, maintaining the same warmth he had shown from the beginning. Henry thanked her with a smile and held out his cup. Looking around, he saw that the Patch and Stripe Cafe had truly fulfilled its promise of becoming a place where everyone was welcomed and respected, regardless of their background or their history. As the afternoon wore on, the Patch and Stripe Cafe was still full of life and laughter. Henry realized that the place had become a space for meeting and community. The diversity of customers was proof of the change that had come about in Ashwood, and it was evident that most of the townspeople supported and appreciated the new spirit of the cafe. At the back of the cafe, Rick was chatting with some of the bikers, who had come not only to support the reopening, but to make sure that the place would always remember its original purpose, to be a symbol of equality and respect. Although some of them used to project a rough image, they displayed a warmth and pride that touched anyone who observed them. At one point, Rick walked up to Henry and gave him a friendly pat on the shoulder. "We've done something good here, my friend. This place isn't just a cafe. It's a reminder of what all of us stand for," he said with a smile. Henry nodded, still marveling at the transformation he had witnessed. "This place is proof that things can change, Rick. Sometimes it just takes a little courage and the support of unexpected friends." Rick nodded, his gaze reflecting a mixture of pride and humility. What happened here was possible because we all came together, and as long as people come together for the right thing, good things can happen. Henry, you gave us a reason to fight back, and believe me, The Patch and Stripe Cafe will always be a home for you and everyone." Henry looked at Rick, grateful for his words. I had never expected to find such a sincere friendship in the least expected place. He felt that coffee now symbolized not only his personal struggle, but that of many people who wanted to see a more just world. Soon after, an older woman approached Henry and Rick's table. He wore a gentle expression and said, "I wanted to thank you for what you have done. Seeing this change in our community fills me with hope. It's a reminder that Ashwood can be better." Henry and Rick exchanged a smile, moved by the woman's words. It was clear that the Patch and Stripe Cafe had touched many people, not just for its coffee and food, but for what it stood for. The stories of transformation and unity were, after all, what gave true value to a place like that. The cafe continued to fill with customers and friends, and night slowly fell on Ashwood. But even as the sun began to set, the happy faces and conversations didn't fade. The community continued to celebrate the change that had come from unity and mutual support. At one point, Emily returned to the table with a smile and a note in her hand. "This is for you," he said, setting the note in front of Henry and Rick. The note had a simple but powerful message. "Thank you for showing that Ashwood is stronger when we are together." Henry took the note, feeling the impact of every word. It was a token of gratitude, but also a testament to the power people have when they decide to come together and fight for what is right. This message perfectly summed up what the Patch and Stripe Cafe meant to all of them. As the lights of the cafe illuminated the space warmly, Henry felt a deep peace, one he hadn't experienced in a long time. Sitting in the Patch and Stripe Cafe, surrounded by new friends and a supportive community, he felt like he had found a place where he could finally belong without reservation. Before leaving, Henry took a moment to look at the coffee once more. Now the Patch and Stripe Cafe was not only a place to enjoy breakfast, but also a space where everyone, no matter their background, was welcome. It was a sign that solidarity could transform any situation, even the most difficult ones. Rick and the other bikers were getting ready to leave, but not before approaching Henry to say goodbye. Each gave him a word of encouragement, a handshake, or a sincere smile. Henry realized that he had found more than allies. He had found a real family. As he left the cafe, Henry looked at the new sign for the Patch and Stripe Cafe one last time. It was a symbol of struggle and triumph, of resistance and unity. His heart was filled with gratitude for all that had been achieved, thanks to the courage and unwavering support of his friends. As he walked back home, Henry reflected on how a simple breakfast at a diner had set off such a powerful chain of events. What had started as a day full of humiliation and rejection had become a turning point for the entire community. Ashwood would never be the same again. The story of Henry and the Patch and Stripe Cafe would be etched in the memory of the people as an example of fighting for equality and justice. And Henry knew that this change, though small, would be an important step toward a better future. On his way back, Henry felt that he carried with him not only the satisfaction of having fought for what was right, but also a renewed hope that with the support of committed people, anything was possible. As Henry returned home, his mind was still filled with memories of the day at the Patch and Stripe Cafe. He felt that he had finally closed a painful chapter of his life and opened another full of meaning, marked by the strength of the community and unity he had found in Ashwood. The night was quiet, and as he looked up at the starry sky, Henry felt an inner peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The days following the cafe's reopening were equally vibrant. The Patch and Stripe Cafe quickly became a landmark for Ashwoodians. It was not only a coffee, but a symbol of change. Entire families flocked there, drawn as much by its new decor and excellent food as by the story of struggle and hope that had transformed the place. Local media continued to cover the history of coffee and how Ashwoodites had come together to create a space of inclusion. Even some national publications mentioned coffee as an example of peaceful resistance and how a community can come together to stand up to discrimination. Henry was invited on several occasions to speak about his experience, and although he was not a man who sought attention, he agreed to tell his story. In each interview, he highlighted the support he had received from Rick, the bikers, and the people of Ashwood, making sure they understood that it wasn't just his fight, but everyone's. As more people heard about the Patch and Stripe Cafe, more tourists and visitors came to the small town of Ashwood, curious to see the place. What was once a diner full of tensions had become a place where people from different cities came to experience the welcoming atmosphere and celebrate the spirit of unity. Over time, the Patch and Stripe Cafe began hosting community events such as game nights, fundraising dinners, and talks on topics important to the community. Rick and his group of bikers were always present, supporting and collaborating at each event, ensuring that the cafe continued to be an inclusive and supportive space. Emily, the young waitress, also became a prominent figure in the cafe. His warmth and dedication made customers feel welcome, and he took care of everyone with a genuine smile. She wore her "Equality Serves All" pin with pride, reminding each customer of the purpose of that place. Henry became a regular customer. Every time he walked into the cafe, he was greeted with smiles and greetings. He had regained his place in the community, not just as a client, but as someone everyone respected and admired for his courage. Sitting in his favorite booth, he watched as the Patch and Stripe Cafe continued to thrive. One day, Rick and Henry found themselves chatting about the impact coffee had had on the town. "Look at how much has changed, Henry," Rick said, pointing to the laughing and sharing people around them. "This place is proof that when we come together, we can achieve great things." Henry nodded, excited. "I never thought something like this would be possible. This place was just another cafe, but now it's so much more than that. He is an example for all of us." Rick smiled at her with a mixture of gratitude and respect. "And it all started thanks to you, friend. Without your courage, without your decision to stand firm that day, none of this would have happened. This place is as much yours as it is all of us." As Henry listened to Rick's words, he felt that all his effort and struggle had paid off. It had been a long and difficult road, but seeing the Patch and Stripe Cafe flourish and bring the community together gave it a sense of purpose and pride. The Patch and Stripe Cafe remained a symbol of change and justice in Ashwood for many years. For Henry and all those who had supported him, every cup of coffee, every conversation, and every smile represented a small but important step toward a more just and compassionate society. And so, the cafe continued to be a meeting place where barriers were broken down and people knew each other without prejudice, a space where everyone could feel safe and welcome. Henry knew that while there was still much room for improvement in the world, coffee was a reminder that step by step, big changes could be made. Ashwood had changed forever, and the Patch and Stripe Cafe would be remembered as the heart of that transformation. And while Henry would continue to face challenges in his life, he knew he would always have a place to belong, a place that he and his friends had transformed into a symbol of hope and resilience. As the months went by, the Patch and Stripe Cafe became a true pillar of the Ashwood community. It was common to see neighbours who had barely known each other before sharing a table, talking and laughing together. The story of coffee's transformation from a place of rejection to one of inclusion was still the subject of many conversations. Henry enjoyed watching the young people of the city enter the cafe and see the photos and objects that adorned the walls. Many of them would come up to him to ask him about his life, his time in military service, and what he had experienced in the cafe before everything changed. Henry, while not one to talk much about his past, found comfort in knowing that his story could inspire others. One afternoon, while Henry was sitting in his favorite booth, a group of high school students approached him. One of them, visibly moved, said to him, "Mr. Henry, we have heard about what happened here. We'd love to hear more about how you and Mr. Rick managed to transform this place." Henry looked at them with a warm smile and motioned for them to sit down. As he told them his story, he felt a sense of pride as he watched the young men listen attentively, their gazes filled with admiration and respect. He explained how, despite the difficulties, he had always found the strength to stand firm. "True strength comes from togetherness, guys," Henry told them, his voice deep and full of emotion. "Sometimes, when the going gets tough, it takes just one person to make the first move and others will follow. Never underestimate the power you have to make a difference." The students listened in silence, absorbing every word. To them, Henry represented not only a war veteran, but also an example of bravery and resilience in times of injustice. They promised to carry forward Henry's teachings and continue to promote inclusion in their own lives. Meanwhile, Rick and the bikers continued to be a constant presence at the cafe, always ready to support any just cause in the community. They even helped organize events and talks with other veterans, where they told their stories of struggle and overcoming. Coffee had become a place where life experiences were shared and learned from others. One day, while Henry was chatting with Rick, Emily came over with a smile and handed them both a small envelope. "It's an invitation to our next event here at the cafe," he explained with obvious emotion. "We are going to organize a night of stories where everyone can share their experiences." Henry and Rick exchanged glances, surprised and grateful for Emily's initiative. They knew that this event would be an opportunity for more people to learn about the history of the Patch and Stripe Cafe and all that it represented. Both gladly accepted the invitation. On the night of the event, the cafe was full. People of all ages and backgrounds came together to listen and share. One by one, attendees climbed onto the small makeshift stage and told their stories, each unique, but united by a common desire to overcome obstacles and create a stronger community. When it was Henry's turn, everyone was silent, waiting to hear his words. Henry walked over to the microphone, watching the audience with a mixture of excitement and gratitude. "What we did here together was not just changing a coffee, we change our community, and I'm proud to say that this fight is for all of us," he said in a firm voice, looking at each person in the place. Henry's words echoed through the cafe, and applause filled the room. Every person there understood that the Patch and Stripe Cafe was more than a business. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together to stand up to injustice and build a better future. Over time, the story of Henry and the Patch and Stripe Cafe began to spread to other nearby communities, inspiring other peoples to create inclusive spaces and promote unity. Ashwood became an example to follow, and many people would travel there just to experience the cafe atmosphere and hear the story that had changed the city. Henry, every time he walked into the cafe, remembered everything he had been through and felt immense pride in what he had accomplished together with Rick, Emily, the bikers, and all the members of the community. He knew that their struggle had left a deep mark on Ashwood and that, thanks to everyone's unity, they had managed to transform a simple place into a symbol of hope. Over the years, the Patch and Stripe Cafe continued to be the heart of Ashwood, a place where all people, no matter their history, were welcome. The townspeople always remembered the day Henry and the bikers stood up to injustice, and how that act of bravery had changed the course of their community. As Henry aged, he became a beloved and respected figure in the cafe. He would always sit in the same booth, greeting everyone who came in with a smile and sharing stories about his youth, his experiences in military service, and the impact of coffee on his life. The children of Ashwood especially loved to hear him, and his stories became local legends. One day, while Henry was sitting in his cabin, Rick came over and patted him on the shoulder. "Henry, I thought you'd like to know that the City Council is considering declaring the Patch and Stripe Cafe a historic landmark in Ashwood," Rick said with a smile. Henry was speechless, feeling a mixture of amazement and gratitude. "I had never imagined that a simple act of resistance could have such a lasting impact." "That's it. Unbelievable, Rick. This coffee means so much to me and to all of us. I'm honored to be a part of something so special," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. On the day the City Council approved the proposal, the news quickly spread throughout Ashwood. To celebrate, Rick organized a ceremony at the cafe where all the townspeople were invited to attend. The small ceremony was simple but meaningful, with speeches from community leaders and emotional words from Henry, who expressed his gratitude to all who had supported him over the years. During the ceremony, Rick unveiled a commemorative plaque that was placed at the entrance of the cafe. The plaque was named after Henry and recalled the history of the cafe, highlighting how an act of resistance and solidarity had brought the community together and changed the city forever. Henry's eyes filled with tears as he saw his name on the plaque, and as he knew that his story would live on in Ashwood for generations to come. Over time, the cafe began to receive visitors from all over the country, people who came to learn about the history of the Patch and Stripe Cafe and to experience the atmosphere of unity and respect that characterized it. Henry's story and the Ashwood community inspired many, and the cafe became a symbol of positive change and justice. Henry continued to visit the cafe regularly, always being greeted with affection and respect by all. Over time, his hair became grayer and his steps slower, but his spirit remained the same. He never lost that spark of courage that had led him to stand up for his rights and change the course of his community. One day, a young man visiting the cafe approached Henry and asked, "Mr. Henry, I have heard your story, and it has inspired me deeply. What is the secret to achieving such a big change?" Henry looked at him with a wise smile and replied, "The secret, young man, is not to be afraid to be the first to take a step. And never, ever underestimate the power of people coming together. When people support each other, they can achieve the impossible." The young man listened intently and nodded, grateful for Henry's words. It was evident that, even in his later years, Henry remained a source of inspiration to many, reminding them that courage and unity are the forces that can truly change the world. In his final days, Henry surrounded himself with friends and family, who always accompanied him to the Patch and Stripe Cafe. The cafe had become his second home, and he spent many hours there, watching the people come and go, enjoying the atmosphere he himself had helped create. On the day Henry finally departed, the people of Ashwood gathered to pay homage to him. Residents gathered at the Patch and Stripe Cafe to remember and celebrate the life of a man who had changed the city with his courage and conviction to do the right thing. Henry's stories were shared once again, and everyone recalled how his fight for equality and justice had left an indelible mark on Ashwood. Rick, moved, organised a mural in Henry's honour on one of the walls of the cafe, where they placed photographs, news clippings and messages of gratitude from townspeople and people from elsewhere who had been inspired by Henry's story. The mural became a permanent reminder of his legacy. From then on, every year, the Patch and Stripe Cafe hosted a celebration in Henry's honour, a day dedicated to unity, respect and equality, where the Ashwood community gathered to remember that man who, with his bravery, had shown that one person, with the support of others, it can bring about powerful change. Henry's story continued to be told to new generations, who grew up hearing how a strong-hearted veteran and a group of bikers with an indomitable spirit had transformed their small town. The Patch and Stripe Cafe remained a symbol of inclusion, resistance and unity in Ashwood. Years later, the cafe was still full of life and laughter, with new generations of customers keeping Henry's spirit and what he stood for alive. Henry's legacy lived on, reminding everyone that the power of a united community is the engine of true and lasting change. Over the decades, the Patch and Stripe Cafe became a place of pilgrimage for those looking for inspiration and strength in their own struggles. The story of Henry, Rick, and the Ashwood community became a local legend, told over and over again, but never losing its power to thrill those who heard it. Visitors who came to the cafe not only went to enjoy the famous breakfast and the cozy atmosphere, but also to see the mural dedicated to Henry, which had become a kind of sanctuary of gratitude and hope. The wall was filled with messages from people who, after hearing the story, were inspired to face their own hardships and fight for justice in their communities. Over time, Rick and the other bikers became the guardians of Henry's story, ensuring that his legacy would never be forgotten. Rick, though older, was still a strong and respected figure in the cafe, a living symbol of the unity that had been born out of Henry's struggle. One day, a young journalist came to Ashwood to cover a story about the Patch and Stripe Cafe. I had heard about Henry's impact and wanted to capture the essence of what that place meant to the town and to the people who visited it. Rick met her at the cafe and showed her Henry's mural, telling her every detail of the story with the same passion he had on the first day. The journalist, moved by what she had heard, decided to write an article that captured the depth of coffee's history and how an act of bravery had transformed an entire community. When the article was published, the story of Henry and the Patch and Stripe Cafe spread even further, reaching people everywhere who felt a special connection to Ashwood and its people. The article attracted more visitors from different parts of the country, all eager to see where the community had come together to overcome discrimination and promote equality. The Patch and Stripe Cafe became a symbol of change, a reminder that justice and kindness always prevail when people come together for a common cause. To honour Henry's memory, Rick and the bikers decided to create a foundation in his name. The Henry Lewis Foundation was dedicated to supporting veterans, fighting discrimination, and fostering inclusion programs in other communities. The cafe hosted charity events and donated a portion of its profits to the foundation, thus keeping Henry's spirit alive. Each year, the anniversary of the Patch and Stripe Café's reopening was celebrated with a large community event. Ashwoodites, along with visitors and people inspired by Henry's story, would gather to remember the impact a single person could have when they found support from a community. It was a celebration of unity, resistance, and hope for a better world. Rick, though already in his later years, was proud to see that Henry's legacy lived on and that each generation of Ashwood grew up knowing the history of coffee and its transformation. His friendship with Henry had been one of the most important experiences of his life, and seeing everything they built continue to thrive was a comfort and a source of joy for him. Over time, the Patch and Stripe Café passed into the hands of the bikers' children and former Ashwood residents, who were committed to keeping the inclusive and welcoming spirit of the place alive. For all of them, coffee was much more than a business. It was a constant reminder of the power of unity and the struggle for justice. One night, after a particularly busy day at the cafe, one of the new owners walked up to Henry's mural and stared at the photos and messages. Next to him, one of the young customers commented, "It's incredible to think that this all started with a cup of coffee and a man who refused to accept injustice." The owner nodded, with a respectful smile on his face. "Henry taught us that we all have the ability to do good, even in the most difficult of times. His legacy is our responsibility now, and every day we strive to keep him alive." The Patch and Stripe Café, with its history of transformation and bravery, continued to be a place where people from all over gathered to remember what Henry and his community had accomplished. The children who heard the coffee story grew up inspired, and many of them were committed to carrying those values forward in their own lives. In the end, the story of Henry and the Patch and Stripe Café transcended time, becoming a life lesson that would continue to resonate in Ashwood and anywhere people dreamed of a more just and inclusive world. And although Henry was no longer there, his presence was still alive in every corner of the cafe, in every smile of the customers, and in every act of kindness that was celebrated there. Over time, the story of the Patch and Stripe Café became as natural to Ashwood as the town's own landscape. People spoke of Henry and his bravery as a local legend, a story that inspired every generation. The people who visited the cafe felt like they were part of something bigger, something Henry and the community had created through their determination and faith in justice. On the 50th anniversary of the cafe reopening, the Ashwood community hosted a large event to commemorate Henry's life and legacy. Rick was gone, and many of the bikers who had supported Henry in his original fight had also departed, but the spirit of all of them remained firmly anchored in every wall and every corner of the Patch and Stripe Café. For this special event, the current owners of the cafe decided to expand the mural dedicated to Henry, adding photos and memorabilia of all those who had contributed to keeping his legacy alive. Now, the mural wall not only honoured Henry, but also Rick, the bikers, and everyone who had fought to make Ashwood a better place. The ceremony began at sunset, and the entire community gathered in silence to remember those who had made coffee and the unity they enjoyed today possible. Warm lights illuminated the Patch and Stripe Café as the town's mayor, one of the descendants of Ashwood's former inhabitants, offered a few words in memory of Henry and all those who had supported him. "Today we remember those who taught us the true meaning of justice and community," the mayor said, looking out at the crowd. "Henry showed us that one person can make a difference, and that unity can overcome any obstacle. This cafe is the symbol of their legacy and of our responsibility to continue to defend those values." At the end of the speech, Ashwoodians and visitors lit candles and placed them in front of the cafe, honouring Henry and his story. The lights flickered softly, reflecting off the windows of the Patch and Stripe Café as a sign of hope and resilience. The crowd remained silent, each person remembering what Henry had represented and the impact his life had had on so many people. With the closing of the ceremony, a gentle rain began to fall, as a blessing that nature granted to that sacred place of the community. Attendees hugged and waved goodbye in peace, knowing that the story of Henry and the Patch and Stripe Café would always live on, both in their hearts and for generations to come. From that moment on, the Patch and Stripe Café became a recognized historical site, a place where people from all over could come and remember that change is possible, even in the smallest places and the most difficult times. Henry's memory and Ashwood's story continued to inspire those seeking justice and unity in Ashwood and beyond. And so, the story of the Patch and Stripe Cafe, of Henry Rick and the Ashwood community, closed a chapter full of love, courage, and hope. His legacy endured, not only as a memory, but as a call to action for all those who sought a more just and better world.